Hi, good morning. I'm Carolina.
And I'm Annalisa.
And we'd like to welcome you to the third episode of The Real Place.
The Real Place is a brand new podcast. It's the first of its kind, a global exclusive, and it's filmed entirely inside the Gemba virtual reality virtual workplace.
Each episode, we send an Oculus Quest wireless VR headset to our guests, wherever they are in the world, and then me and Annalisa put on our quests and jump into the virtual world to meet and interview them. We invite true experts, visionaries, people who have been there, done that, and have the scars to prove it. And the premise of the podcast is that each one of them gives us just one prediction for the future.
Could be a prediction about how we're going to work, how a specific industry is going to change, or it could be very focused on one company, one challenge, or even one individual. Either way, the aim is to go beyond buzzwords and really get to grips with the changes in business and society that are coming our way.
And I'm sure, just like us, you've read so much about how everything's going to change. What we want to know is how those at the forefront of the world's top brands think and act, really peeling back the layers to understand how we could be doing things better to create positive change.
Thanks, Carolina. That brings us on to our guest for today. Throw away your management books, as today we have Greg Dyke, a former Director General at the BBC and a chairman of the Football Association and British Film Institute. Greg tells us what it really takes to lead your teams to success.
And just before we jump in, make sure to stay tuned until the end of the episode as we ask our guests to nominate a colleague, partner, or a rival to join us in The Real Place next time. So stay tuned for that and enjoy the episode.
So excited today to have Greg Dyke with us in The Real Place. It's your first time in The Real Place, Greg, but for all our first-time viewers, each episode we ask one guest, one prediction for the future, and this could be an industry, one company, or just anything that's on your mind. So what's your prediction for the future, Greg?
Well, I think when COVID is gone, we go back to normal. I think the idea that it's changed our lives, I don't believe.
Why do you think so? Because everyone seems to think there is a new normal coming.
I think if people are going through this sort of experience for months on end, which by and large they don't do, they think it's a fundamental change. I suspect it's not. I suspect people will go back to working in offices. People will go back to the lives they had before. They'll fly as much as ever. They'll go on holiday as much as ever, but not now.
Fair enough. So, Greg, is this your kind of desire for the future? Do you want things to go back to normal?
Yeah, I think I do.
The way they were?
Not exactly, but I think what was novel for the first 3 months is now pretty dull. And I think people want to go back to having it. People who are used to a more interesting life will go back to it.
And this is a great question because, I think a lot of people have different views on this in terms of what is the new normal, what is normal, and what is happiness. What are people experiencing right now? So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just in terms of your present kind of experience, you said that it's quite dull right now for a lot of people. What does that look like? What do you mean by what's the current situation you think in the world right now compared to going back to
Well, I think people have stopped traveling. People have stopped going to the cinema. The theatres are all closed. Pubs are disproportionately closed. Particularly younger people, I think, will just halfway through this will abandon that anyway. But I think people will go back to a life that they're used to as opposed to this, which is, as I said, novel but not real.
What about a handshake? There's a big debate that the handshake is not coming back.
It will be interesting. I think it took the average Brit about 1,000 years before they started hugging anybody else, and now they're not allowed to do it. I think they'll go back to hugging people. I've no idea how the Italians are surviving at the moment at all.
Must be hard. Greg, for our viewers, I think it's important to reflect on all of your incredible achievement. As a Director General at the BBC, you've introduced 6 new BBC channels. You launched Freeview, digital television platform, pretty much speeding up the transition from analog to digital. You also served as a chairman of both BFI and Football Association, really injecting a fresh style of management that engaged staff, in a way only a few had done before. And Amanda Neville, our guest on the previous episode, considers you her biggest inspiration to date. So, Greg, what did it really take to get a career like yours?
Well, there were no plans. I went to a grammar school in a working class part of London. I failed most of my exams, left, got a job as on a local newspaper as a reporter, and then in my mid-20s decided to go to university. And that fundamentally, that changed my life. I think I just took the opportunities as they came. Never underestimate luck in life. Things come at the right time.
So did you just decide to say yes to everything?
But I never stayed there or did the same job for more than about 3 or 4 years. Most of the times my choice, but sometimes not. But I think I had a view particularly of management and a view of running organizations that seemed to work.
Could you expand on that? Because our viewers are leaders in those roles and always constantly looking for inspiration of what should the leadership look like?
I suppose I discovered it when I first became a television producer and the editor of the show and those sorts of things. And my sort of fairly naive view of how you organize and motivate people seemed to work. And I suppose I learned as I got to bigger organizations that actually if you carried on in that sort of means of communication and that sort of trusting people, it was quite effective.
So what do you mean by naive approach?
The great danger of getting a job in management is to start aping the behavior of other managers you've known. With what you want to be is you. And if you're you, then that allows you to do all sorts of things. You can actually say, I got that wrong, or I'm sorry, or, you did that well. But it is about trusting people. It's about, you've got to motivate the people who work for you. That's the single most important thing in any organization. How do you motivate them? Well, I think you motivate them by trusting them, discussing things with them. If things go wrong, well, you're all to blame, aren't you? It's not just one person.
Lovely. Thank you for that. I think to kind of touch on that, Greg, you said that, trust is the most important thing to really create between a leader and, their followers. Right now, a lot of people, as you said, are experiencing a lot of dullness. And as I said, just in their daily lives, they're feeling quite low, quite demotivated. So what can leaders today do to kind of lift people up and motivate them again?
Well, while they're still meeting on Zoom as opposed to meeting in real person, it's harder. Because this idea that leadership is about you micromanaging everybody, I think is ridiculous. The job is to trust people and let them get on with the job. And if they get it wrong, so that's life.
I'm going to stick on this point. I love this, Graham, but I'm going to stick on this point again, trust, because I think this word is used very loosely by a lot of people, and it's a very poignant word right now because a lot of people are working remotely. So it's very hard for leaders to micromanage a staff member that's remote. So, they need to trust that the employees are doing what they need to be doing and should be doing, in their homes while they're not being policed or watched 24/7. So, again, how do we really build that trust both ways, I guess, not just a one-way street.
I don't think that's only the experience of living through the COVID experience. I think it's experience of work generally. Let people get on with the job you've asked them to do. Don't micromanage them. Don't think you could do it better, because otherwise why employ them?
Love that. Greg, you have assumed many roles. Your back catalogue is amazing. British businessman, journalist, broadcaster, director general, mentor, father. Some have called you Mr. Popular or popular hero or just a good bloke. Who is the real Greg Dyke?
Well, ask my wife. She'll tell you. Well, I'm now in my 70s. And when you get to your 70s, you know yourself better. I've now got grandchildren. In some way, I wish I'd spent more time with my own kids when they were that age, but I was out making a career. But I enjoy being with grandchildren. I enjoy, one grandchild was 1.5 years, and he lived with us for 3 or 4 months. And it was just an interesting experience that, as I say, I never really had with my own kids because I was not there. I was, the sort of jobs I did demanded a lot of time. The real me, okay, it's very difficult to define, for anyone to define who is the real you. There's lots of things in life that I haven't done that I wished I'd done. I mean, I wish I'd learned to play. I spoke more languages. I wish I'd learned to play the piano and the guitar and all those things that I didn't do. But I don't think I've been very good at any of them. I think what I discovered about myself was that I could motivate people. I don't need to do it so much now because I'm by and large, semi-retired, I'm chairman of a few things, but I was a natural chief executive, not a natural chairman, I think.
I was just going to ask, because there's certainly certain qualities about you that I'm sure people gravitate towards, and, that made you so successful in those roles. And I know it's hard to self-reflect, but I think it's so important that some people that view this podcast hear that. So as much as you can, just give people an idea of what that looks like. I think that would be amazing.
Well, when I left the BBC in quite controversial circumstances, by and large with my board, a lot of my staff walked out and took to the streets and said, we want Greg back. That made what was a pretty awful day better because it demonstrated what we have been trying to do for 3 years, which was to communicate, to make them think we cared. And I think a lot about running organizations is making the people who work for you feel trusted and that you care for them. It's not very complicated, I don't think, although I'm always amazed by how few people actually do it.
There you go. So there must be something, but thank you for your honesty. Greg, just to kind of stick on that, even just talking to you now, I feel like you're just such an easy guy to relate to, and you seem very open, no nonsense, what you see, at least what I see with your avatar is what you get. And that's quite powerful, I think, for, for people right now. You want to feel that you are talking to real people who are just authentic, just themselves. There's no airs, there's no graces. And it's so refreshing to hear you speak about this as if it's just, as you said, second nature. You're just a natural, just being yourself. You're not trying too hard. You're not complicating things.
And you have to have the confidence, though. I mean, I suppose I learned it through being a television producer and an editor, and then I became the chief executive of London Weekend, and I went off to Harvard, to the business school, to do one of these 12-week things. And it was very interesting. There was a bloke teaching there called John Cotter, and John Cotter, I discovered it was all about leadership. Now today there are a million courses on leadership. In those days, this was 30 years ago. There was hardly anything. And John Cotter did a whole course on leadership. And I realized that he was describing what I tried to do. And for me, that was incredibly powerful because it gave me the confidence that when I went back to run a pretty big organization, London Weekend Television, I could just carry on being me. And I think one of the great dangers is that people, when they get a job in leadership, as I said earlier, they try to ape what they think is the leader. And actually, what I've always said to them is just be you. Just be you. If you're a pain in the ass, sometimes you can be a pain in the ass. If you're funny, be funny. But don't try and be something else because they'll see through that in no time.
For someone who's struggling to get out of that, and there are, I'm sure, tons of people, is there anything you can give them as like an advice of something immediately that they can look at and get out of that rut of, the position that they're holding and just be a little bit more themselves?
Well, you've got to be straight. What you can't do is to pretend to be something that you're not. And how do they get out of it? They got to go home one night and say, who am I? What are we trying to achieve? And what's the best way of achieving this? I mean, I always had this theory that I put in a leadership course at the BBC that everybody who managed anybody had to go on a leadership course in the end. And my theory, I suppose, was that 10% are natural leaders, got the charisma, got all the rest. 10% are never going to be leaders no matter what you do. And most of the others can learn the techniques if someone tells them and trusts them to do it.
Did you have a mentor that helped you, or was it all kind of internal within yourself?
Well, it was different bits, really. I had a guy called Christopher Bland, who was my chairman at London Weekend Television and then at BBC. He was a different sort of leader in the sense that he was quite tough and the rest of it. And I think we softened him a bit over time. But he, on the other hand, taught me about clarity. Just go for it. Just do it. Just work out what you want to do and do it. And I suspect that's a degree of risk that a lot of people won't take. Sometimes you've just got to say, okay, Carolyn Fairbairn, who at the moment runs the CBI, worked for me at the BBC. And she once said, the thing about Greg is, once you get to 80%, we go. There is no 100%. And anyone who believes it, and sometimes you've got to try things and they're not going to work. So they don't work. Get on, move on to the next thing. I mean, I think one of the interesting things that's always interested me about someone like Rupert Murdoch, who I had a fair number of bust-up with over the years, but what he was a genius at was going down one route, and when it didn't work, turning right or turning left and going somewhere else and getting on with something else. And I think that's what you've got to do. Not everything's going to work. Not all your ideas are going to work. But as long as you recognize that, and as long as you've got the confidence of your board and the people around you, do something else.
I think this is gold dust, Greg, and you have me excited. I mean, I feel like I would love for you to mentor me. But one thing that's kind of stuck out for me is that, leadership also means responsibility and accountability. So yes, you have to take these chances, but, a lot of leaders don't want to take those risks because, they don't want to regret the decisions that they've made. They don't want the kickback when things go wrong. And I think right now, especially again in this pandemic, a lot of leaders are faced with, hard decisions that they don't want to make.
But nobody, I don't think, ever became really successful by not taking decisions. So you've got to take decisions. If you're the leader, you've got to take the decisions. It's quite lonely at times, I think. It will always interest me when I look back at the people who are my friends now, who I met at stages in my career. Not many of them did I meet when I was a chief executive. I met most of them when I was a young researcher or a young reporter or a young producer. They're quite lonely jobs, I think, which means you want stability of a family, and you've got to have confidence in yourself. I mean, you mentioned earlier when we started Freeview, I mean, everybody at the BBC, I think, saw it as dangerous. They saw it as, why are we doing this? This could go badly wrong. Didn't. It went very well. And because of that, it changed what free television was going to be like for the next decade or so.
Is there any argument that you had to use with your teams internally, or was it just your decision?
No. Well, Freeview was different. Freeview was three of us sitting in an office inventing the idea, really. And then just going ahead and pushing it with it. But usually, a lot of them are not my ideas. They're their ideas. Like the iPlayer, which was, the idea was created when I was at the BBC. It happened after I'd left. That's because the governors were too slow to approve it. But the iPlayer came out of the department, came out from way down, and just a good idea. And that's the other opportunity. You've got to give people the opportunity to where can they place their good ideas. I mean, but it's different. I remember once somebody came up to me with quite a good idea and said, I need £5,000 to do this at the BBC. And I said, look, if you don't know how to find £5,000 in the BBC, you shouldn't be here. And, take the risk. Go find it. Most of it is a resource. Persuade a cameraman to come out and help you do it. You've got to take risks.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I think with that, we might want to move to another room. I'm thinking a rooftop bar just to keep things interesting. All right, so I think I'd like to continue from the conversation that Annalise has briefly touched up upon. We've obviously both read your autobiography, The Inside Story, which is incredibly inspiring. And I think it's really clear that you're known for taking chances. Your precursors did not, and having that the automatic respect for those in authority. I think it's important that we ask you, what chances should the leaders be taking right now amidst the pandemic?
Well, this is a difficult time. I mean, the businesses that I'm still in, I mean, I've still got quite a lot. I was chairman of a big theatre company for a long time. I've still got quite a lot of money invested in that. Well, that's disaster at the moment. I'm in the hotels business. Again, not a great one. I think strange place. Now, what it seems to me is you have to, whenever I have meetings, which I do most days now with people running, particularly the hotels business, we've done the worst case scenarios, so we know we'll be here in 18 months' time, because that seems to me what businesses are about at the moment. You had a good business, it was working well, bang, one day it's gone. It's suddenly there's no customers, you're not allowed to run. And the support the government gave you was quite big to start with and is getting less by the day. I think you've got to now plan for the future on the basis of, how long does this thing last? And if you work on the basis it's going to last for another 18 months, you've got to see, will your business survive it? So it's about planning and thought, and then it's about communicating with people, because if you're thinking it's doubtful whether we make it, what are your staff thinking? And therefore they're all worried. So you've got to, the relationship with your staff is all about communication. It's all about keeping them informed, involved, and optimistic.
Your Wikipedia page says that you described BBC in early 2000, I think it was 2001, as hideously white, based on statistics that showed the organization's management structure, I think, was about 98% white. You also said something similar while at the Football Association. I think you said it's still overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white in a world that isn't overwhelmingly male and white.
It was also overwhelmingly old, the leadership of it.
What were some of the measures that you were trying to introduce at the time to increase diversity? What were some of those measures that you deployed? And how do you believe things have changed since?
Well, Hideously White was 20 years ago now. And it's actually 20 years next year. And I'm thinking of doing a program about it, just saying what has changed. What has changed both in the BBC, but what has also changed? I mean, I was interviewed by someone on BBC Scotland on a program for ethnic minorities. And they said, don't you think the media is hideously white? And I said, I think the BBC is hideously white. Never thought any more about it until it was the front page lead on the Mail on Sunday the following week. And what was interesting was the letters columns and the letters we got were so hostile. Basically, it was a bunch of disproportionately middle class old people saying, of course it's white, we're a white country. And what I was trying to say is, no, look at the demographics of this country and look at what's happening and look at where it's going to be in 20 years. Don't kid yourself. This is changing. And unless we change as an organization, we have no chance. Now, do I think the BBC has changed? Well, that's what I want to find out in this documentary. Certainly on screen, it's changed a lot. I remember around that time I met a guy, a black guy who used to be on Cassie. And he said that, as a kid, he said they used to shout up the stairs, parents used to shout up the stairs to him saying, come down, there's a black man on the television. And today that's normal and not even questioned. Whether behind the scenes, whether the BBC executive is still as white as it was, I think the answer is probably yes. We basically introduced a star chamber. We basically said to everybody who was running big parts of the organization, right, every 3 months we're going to go through your numbers and on ethnic minorities and see if anything's getting better. Now, what was interesting about the BBC is that a lot of the people who would have agreed with me didn't realize that the numbers in their part of the organization were terrible. So they started changing. And we did change quite a lot over 3 years, really. We didn't change that much at the senior management, but in the organization overall, we made some gains. Whether they've still been made, I don't know. I suspect not. The idea was, I used it to say to the organization, look, this really matters. This really matters. We've got to do something about this. Now, I think all those people who vote to me who are offended by what I said, who saw it, who are hostile, I don't think they do that now. I think the world has changed and that people understand, or many more people understand. Also, without being rude, a lot of those people were in their 60s and 70s then, and they're not here now.
So in terms of, I guess, the change that you've seen at the BBC, do you think that that's also, have you seen any change in other organizations that you have left, like the Football Association and, in film as well, in the film industry? Can you see the change happening, even if it is?
Well, it's interesting. At the BFI, when I was chairman, we had a proposal come to the board, which was the usual old ethnic minority, you know, this stuff really matters, but we're not going to do anything. Basically, we're not going to do anything. And at the board, we threw it out and said, no, come back. We give away a lot of money to support film in this country. We want a proposal that tells you you don't get the money unless you're seen to be taking this change seriously. And I think it did change, but probably changed faster this year than any year. Now, whether that actually changes the numbers, I don't know. We'll see. But I think there is an awareness now that you can't have whole industries where in the leadership and in the makeup of the industry, there are very few ethnic minorities.
We look forward to seeing that program whenever you manage to do it. Sounds really interesting. Greg, I'd like to go back to what we discussed about your decision to resign. I think that's such a big moment, and I'd love our viewers to hear a context of it all. Of course, back in 2004, when you filed your resignation, it was reported that groups of staff staged walkouts. You know, it was across Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, Glasgow, Cardiff, London. I think around a third of the total BBC staff at the time expressed their support for you with some incredible words, like Greg stood for brave, independent, rigorous journalism. You know, through his passion and integrity, he inspired us to make programs of highest quality. I'd love for you to share, you know, how you felt at the time it was all happening, and also what lesson did that teach or could teach to other leaders.
Well, it was a pretty rough time. I lost the confidence of the board, of the governors, I think wrongly. I think their job was to support. They were very worried about having to negotiate a new licensing agreement with government. My view of the world was that's not our major priority at the moment. Major priority is the quality of our journalism and were we or were we not right. And at the time, it was quite interesting. I think it wasn't, you know, most people I think thought we were right, but not everybody. Today, who doesn't think that Blair and co sexed up the case for war? Everybody knows it. It's all the evidence come out since. But in terms of the leadership, the one I loved was Radio Shropshire and Shrewsbury. The whole lot came out and they carried on broadcasting from the streets and kept the program going from the street. I think they did it. I mean, this was about, you know, it stood up for brave and journalism and the rest of it. I don't think it was about that. I think it was about they thought I cared about them. I'd done a lot of, I've been to every local radio station in the country. I've been around I talked to you can't talk to everybody, but I had a means of communication. It was the early days of emails, really. But I regularly sent out emails for all the staff, and I wrote them. You know, I trained as a journalist. I wrote them, and they were short and concise, sometimes funny, sometimes not, but they weren't boring. And, you know, the thing about if management want to communicate with their staff, they've got to make it interesting, because otherwise, why else would they read it? So make it short, make it, you know, fast, and make it interesting, and say things they want to hear. So, I mean, I remember once when I wasn't there, they put one out in my name, and I was so annoyed. The communications team, I was so annoyed because I thought it was so dull. And they've got to be fast, and that's the way you've got to communicate with your staff. And the real trick is if you can't communicate with your staff, you're not going to make it as a leader.
Greg, honestly, I think what you said there, it really has struck a chord with us, and I'm sure it struck a chord with our viewers. Words like confidence, motivation, communication, as I said, these are words that, you know, tend to get thrown about a lot. And a lot of people say that they or believe that they are good leaders or great leaders. And as Carolina pointed out, that moment in time where you had your people, your employees out in the streets clamoring, you know, for you, that must have been, I guess, the validation that you are a great leader. You have made an impact, a great impact on people's lives, and they do care about you. And that, I think, is a great testimony to your life and your body of work.
I mean, recently I had someone at the BBC phone me up, quite senior, and say, would you come in and have a chat? Because there's a new opportunity. There's a new leader here. There's a new opportunity to actually have an impact again. You know, how do I have the impact that you had? You've got to have the confidence to do it. And it inevitably, I mean, I don't think I ever fully got the board of the BBC on side. I don't think I was their sort of type. You know, I didn't go to an English public school. I didn't go to Oxbridge. You know, someone there once said to me, well, over the years, we've employed the brightest and the best. And I always said, no, actually what you've employed are men who went to English public schools. You can't assume that they're the brightest and the best. And given that that's not your audience, what are you doing for your audience?
What would be your advice for other companies that, are struggling to stay close to the customer? I think this is a constant struggle. Certainly our members want to know more about how do you do that. Is there anything that you can advise?
Communicate with your staff first, because if they don't, they can sell what you're trying to do better than anybody else. But they've got to understand it. They've got to feel confidence in it. And almost they've got to, what I always said was that they've got to give you the benefit of the doubt. So if you're doing something that they don't agree with, but because they've got confidence in you, they'll go along with it. They'll go along with it. I think the same applies to your customer. I mean, it's harder in something like television because who are your customers? I mean, when I was in commercial television, when I was working for Running London Weekend, your customers are the audience, but the people you're selling to are the advertisers. So there's two markets really. Now, what I did there was just said, look, if we can get the right audience, the rest will happen. So I spent quite a lot of money just particularly on drama, trying to get a bigger audience on Saturdays and particularly Sunday nights.
In terms of, you mentioned that, you had the confidence to really, excel wherever you went, whatever you put your mind to, and overcome, as you said, some very controversial moments in your life. Where did that confidence come from? Because I know you said, look, I didn't come from, I didn't have a silver spoon in my mouth, so to speak. But where do you attribute your confidence? Did it come from family? Was there someone that you would highlight in your life that really just gave you that confidence? What was it?
I always remember one friend saying to me, the only reason you've been successful is that you didn't have the imagination to imagine failure, which I always thought was quite an interesting description of me. I'm incredibly optimistic. I think most things work and will work. And I think that helps. I think if you're not basically optimistic, it's quite hard to run an organization. Where did the confidence come from? I don't know. It didn't come from my childhood. My father, who I love dearly, always said I was the most determined kid. He had 3 sons. He said I was the most determined kid he'd ever had. I was the third son. If you're the third son, you have advantages and disadvantages. The advantages is you can get away with anything. The disadvantage is nobody really notices you much. You're just, unlike a first child or first grandchild, they get so much attention. By the time you get to the 5th or 6th, they get any attention at all, do they? And I was one of those. I didn't get that much attention. I went to university as a 24-year-old without the normal qualifications, only because I thought you needed only clever people. You needed to show you were clever, because I discovered later it wasn't true. The people at university are there because of where they came from, not from necessarily being cleverer than everybody else. But going to university gave me confidence, I think, that I could do things. And particularly I was there at 24, and then most of the other people were 18 or 19. You got a bit of a reputation because of it. But I don't know, really, is the answer. It's just, I look at my kids, and so I think 2 of them have got that same sort of confidence. Whether they'll decide to use it is another matter.
Thank you for that, Greg. That really means a lot. As I said, I think me personally, I think in this life, it's very easy for anyone to feel low or, feel that their confidence is a bit short at times, at different stages of their life, but it's how you rebound. So I'm always very curious how people like yourself, maintain that optimism and that passion.
Well,
and
the hardest thing of my business, of my company life, I think, was when I was chief executive of London Weekend Television, and Granada made a hostile bid for it, and they took the company away. And they asked me to stay on and run it, and I said, no, you don't understand. I think you're the enemy. I don't want to work for you. I'd also made a lot of money, so I shouldn't complain. But it was interesting. Both Christopher Bland and I would much rather have had kept the company and not had the money. Money didn't matter that much. What mattered was running our organization. And we've done a lot of work on getting it in shape and getting people on side. Because these were the days when television was disproportionately run by the trade union, and we had to change that. I mean, it was weird because I used to be the representative for the producers and directors on behalf of the union. And when I became the chief executive, I had to undo half the stuff I'd negotiated. But I said to everybody, look, we all knew it was daft when we got it. I always remember one trade union leader saying to me, look, don't blame us, Governor. Don't blame us. You gave these deals. We didn't, we just asked, we're obviously going to take the most we can get. And when I got to the BBC, I set up this system whereby we met with the trade unions quite regularly. And quite often I tried to do things that would surprise them. I mean, for instance, making sure everybody at a lower level got decent pay awards, better than everyone else, because they were on the lowest sphere, Well, that's what unions are supposed to argue for, but they didn't understand why the boss was arguing for it.
Thank you for your tremendous honesty. I think this is super valuable for all of our viewers and for ourselves, really, to learn from. So thank you for that, Greg. I think I'll take us to the lounge just so we can, and hopefully you had a time to think about who you'd like to be on our podcast next. So, Greg, in each episode of The Real Place, we always finish on the nomination. You've been nominated by Amanda Neville, and you've kindly accepted. So now it's your turn. Who you'd like to be on the podcast next time?
I don't think he'll be able to read my writing, so...
Okay, we'll capture the screenshot anyway.
Well, hang on, I've dropped it. Do you want me to carry it again?
Yep.
Okay. I'm nominating Trevor Phillips, but I think his perspective on leadership would be really interesting.